I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. I wasn't very far into my family history journey when I first encountered those dreaded words: courthouse burned, records destroyed. If you've done much genealogy, I'm sure that you've encountered the curious propensity that American courthouses have to spontaneously combust. Colloquially, genealogists referred to counties that have suffered record loss due to some sort of disaster as burned counties. It's a bit of a misnomer, as many locations have lost records due to other things like flooding, tornadoes, or various other disasters. It's accurate enough, though, to be commonly used. Courthouses in the American South have a real habit of burning down, and while many people attribute this to the devastation of the Civil War, that's not entirely accurate. Yes, many courthouses in the South were burned during the course of the war, particularly in Virginia. But the reality is probably just as many courthouses have burned after the Civil War, whenever it became convenient to someone or a group of people for certain records within the courthouse to disappear. My own hometown courthouse burned and was completely destroyed in 1968. However the disaster befell the courthouse in the county of your interest, it can present a challenge to you as a researcher. How do you find information if the records containing that information have been irrevocably lost? I'd love to be able to tell you that there's some surefire ways that you can surmount this challenge, but there just aren't any. Sometimes the information really is inaccessible. But the rule in genealogy is you never give up until you've looked everywhere. And even then, most good genealogists never really give up on a research question. What I can offer you are some things that might help improve your chances of finding the information that you're looking for, even if the primary records that contain it were lost due to a disaster of some sort. Before we get into looking for ways to get around record loss, it's best to confirm that there was, in fact, record loss and what the extent was. Oftentimes, there was in fact a fire that occurred, but it may only have destroyed the boiler room and damaged a few adjacent rooms. Perhaps there was some record loss, but it might only have been to certain record collections, or maybe even only parts of certain record collections. So, before you go making your life harder than it really needs to be, verify that record loss. There's some pretty good books covering the topic, but for me, the easiest way to verify is to just go right to the source and call the courthouse. One of two things will happen. You'll either speak to someone who has no idea what you're talking about, or you'll get all the details of what was lost and what wasn't. If you find out that the records that you're looking for are intact, then hey, you're in luck. They may not be online, and so you may have to go in person, but at least you know where they are. If you get that person who has no idea what you're talking about, you can either try to find someone else from the courthouse, preferably an older person who can talk to you, or you can hit up the local genealogical society because they'll know exactly what was lost and what wasn't. If you're doing in-person research, even though the records from the years that you're interested in may have been burned, you might try having a look at the records since the burn, and you might find that there are some partial records from pre-burn periods in with the newer records. Just like with the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, even in really bad fires, it's not all that uncommon for some records to survive. But let's say that you do this, and you get some bad news. The records that you were looking for really were lost. Let's look at the ways that you can still answer your research question. I'm intentionally avoiding talking about specific record types and how you might search for substitute records because that would just require too many different approaches. So what I'm going to talk about is a more general approach that is, at its foundation, just good genealogical habits. It has thankfully gotten pretty easy to do very good family history research without having to be all that disciplined as a researcher. But once the going gets tough, you'll have to be able to flip that switch and put on your detective's hat. So let's get to work. First things first, you're going to want to look for substitute records. And what I mean by that is other record collections than the primary source of that kind of information that you want. As a quick example, you're perhaps looking for the will of your research subject to make a list of all of their children. Let's say that the probate's office burned and those records were lost. There are other records that might help you piece together the answer to your questions, though, such as deed records that could have been created as a part of the probate process. Those are substitute records. Every bit of information that you'll look for as a genealogist has the primary place where it's found, but there may be half a dozen other places where it can be found as well, or at least pieced together. As usual, if you have a hard time thinking of what substitute records might exist for the information you're looking for, have a look at the Family Tree Wiki. It's helpful to both read up about the county that you're researching in, but also look at the kinds of records that are available for that county, and then read up about those record types and what kind of information they contain. The more genealogy you do, the less you'll have to do this as you get accustomed to the types of records that you'll find at various repositories and the information that they contain. Once you've made a list of the potential substitute records, go ahead and list them into your research plan. If you haven't done a research plan, when you're dealing with burned counties, it's really a good idea to have one. So go back to episode 5 and learn how to plan your research. While you're at it, go back and listen to episode 10 and make sure you're up to speed on research logging. Because if you're hunting around in the margins, like you will be with burned county research, if you don't, I guarantee you'll end up finding the same record 5 times and getting excited 5 times about it, only to be disappointed 5 times because it doesn't have the info that you want. If you're logging your research and consulting it as you move along your research plan, that won't happen. Logging is also valuable because you might be finding out little pieces of the answer that you're looking for one bit at a time. Information that maybe seems insignificant when you're reviewing the source might become useful in light of other sources you find later. Having what you've searched for and what you've found all together in a nice, neat log will allow you to regularly review these little bits of info, and that's when you're going to have your aha moment and realize that you're done looking because with everything that you've found, you can infer the answer through indirect or negative evidence. And not to keep plugging old episodes, but that's covered in episode 7, Types of Evidence. It's useful when you're putting together your plan to think about things like evolving borders of counties. Although your ancestors may have lived in what is today one county, during their lives, their land may have been a part of a different and still existent county. So figure out what jurisdiction they lived in and research in both the county seat of the historic county and the modern county. Ideally, the records would have been transferred when the county change of boundaries was made, but things are never perfect, and you may find that your target records weren't burned because they never got transferred from the historic county. Speaking of record location, it's very often that courthouses will have sent copies of certain records to state archives, so while the originals may have burned, there might be copies of the originals at the state archives, so you don't have to sweat finding substitute records. It's perhaps a little less common for your typical courthouse records, but sometimes copies of records have been sent to the National Archives as well. Don't just focus on one ancestor that you're interested in. When you're facing this kind of brick wall, it's best to pick your head up out of the trenches and broaden your horizon a bit. Look at the whole family, and don't forget your friends, neighbors, and associates. You'll almost never get the direct answer this way, but again, you can sometimes piece it together bit by bit. In addition to the kinds of official records that you'll find at the courthouse or other government archives, think of the kinds of places that might take records that have the answers that you're looking for, but that we don't often go to, like schools, churches, funeral homes, businesses, those sorts of things. I've spoken with a few university archivists, and you'd be really surprised the kinds of records that some schools hold on to for a very long time. Really, I probably could have summarized this whole episode by saying, go back and listen to all my older episodes and do those things, because that's what burned county research is really all about, being thorough, disciplined, and methodical, and adhering to best practices. No, not every answer can be had this way, but there are so many brick walls out there that exist only because the people researching them aren't taking it seriously enough. Frustratedly searching for hours and hours for a source that you're never going to find because it doesn't exist is exactly the kind of beginner mistake that makes people quit genealogy. They think they've found everything that can be found and they move on to the next hobby. So instead, choose to be a serious genealogist and be that person whose tree stands as a beacon of hope for others who are just starting themselves. Burned county research can be frustrating, but making discoveries by flanking around the record loss and finding your answers elsewhere can be really rewarding. It's common that you'll know perhaps a dozen or so people that have brick walls in their family tree regarding a particular ancestor who comes from a burned county, but when you can be that first person to knock down that wall and update your tree with the new information, it feels really good. It's positive feedback that you're doing the right things and that you're a good genealogist. I hope you found something useful today. It was really kind of a smattering of a number of different things, but I'm sure that if you put it together, you'll find yourself seeing answers where before you had only seen questions. If you've struggled with burned county research in the past, I'd love to hear about it on Twitter, @the WGT Pod. or on Facebook. Links for both in the description. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.